This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please support us on Patreon over at patreon.com/geeks or via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. And I want to give a special thank you to Elder Astardi, Jeffrey Maricini, Sharon B-Side, and Will, who all just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so now let's get to our show. Hi, I'm David Barr Kirtley, author of the book Save Me Please and Other Stories, and welcome to episode 580 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Melinda Snodgrass, making her 6th appearance on the show. She's the author of over a dozen novels, including The High Ground, Lucifer's War, and This Case Is Gonna Kill Me. And her Star Trek script, The Measure of a Man, has been voted as one of the 10 best Star Trek scripts of all time. Together with George R. R. Martin, she edits the Wildcard series of shared world superhero anthologies. And in this interview, we'll be discussing her 1987 anthology, A Very Large Array, which collects some of the best short stories by the New Mexico Mafia, a close-knit community of science fiction writers that formed in New Mexico in the 1970s and 1980s. And now here's our interview with Melinda Snodgrass. All right, so we're here with Melinda Snodgrass. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you, David, for getting in touch and us getting to talk again. I miss seeing you guys.
Yeah, it's always, this is your sixth appearance on the show. Always good to talk to you, and definitely next time we swing by Santa Fe, we will be sure to say hi.
And I'll get to meet the baby.
Yeah. So since we last spoke, Steph and I got married. We found out she was pregnant, and we now have a 2-month-old baby. So yeah, it's been a pretty busy year or so.
I would say that's an intense year. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll mention, so our baby, if anyone doesn't know, is named Taryn Amber Kirtley, and her middle name Amber obviously is a reference to Roger Zelazny's Chronicles of Amber, my favorite book series. So I always thought, for years, if I ever had a daughter, I might want to name her Amber, and Steph went for the middle name. I couldn't get the first name, but I like she has a beautiful first name, so it all worked out. But let's talk about you. So we're here today to talk about your anthology, A Very Large Array. So how'd that come about?
Well, it all started when my old law professor, Fred Ragsdale, became the president of the UNM Press. And at the time, the press was in real financial straits. They were struggling to meet payroll and to, stay afloat. And in one of the first board meetings, Fred said, "Do you realize that some of the greatest science fiction writers in the world live in New Mexico?" And of course they didn't. They were like, "Really?" And he said, "I think we could get them to donate some stories and do an anthology and help us, hopefully save the press." And he said, "But my only condition is I want my friend Melinda, my former student, to be the editor." So they said, "Okay, that sounds fine." And then Fred got in touch with me and asked if I'd be willing to do this. And I said, "Sure." We are all writers, so education, particularly higher education, is very important to us. And we wanted to help preserve the press. So I started calling Roger and Fred Saberhagen and George and, various different people who are in New Mexico and ask if they would be willing to donate a story, because obviously the press couldn't pay us because the press was in trouble. And so everyone stepped up immediately. They were just great about it. Jack Williamson, gave us one of his wonderful stories. And then I compiled it. And then the next question is, we needed a title. And the late, great Ed Bryant kept agitating, even though Ed isn't in the book because he's not a New Mexico writer, but Ed was going, you should call it Them, based on that horror movie about the giant ants, because I think that was set in New Mexico. And Them didn't go over real well. So then we settled on a very large array based on the fact that we have one of the largest radio telescopes arrays in the world in New Mexico. And so then I went and found an artist. I wanted a New Mexico artist, and to create the cover, which is, the aliens riding a weird critter in front of one of the big radio telescopes. And in fact, this book saved the press. It sold better than anything they had, and we saved the press. And I'm pleased to report the press is strong and vital and publishing books and doing very well still all these years later.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, I was so excited when I came across this book. I just I forget how I came across it on Amazon. And it's called A Very Large Array, New Mexico Science Fiction and Fantasy. And like I said, Roger Zelazny is my favorite writer, and George R. R. Martin is my favorite living writer. And there's just so many great writers in and around Albuquerque and Santa Fe. And I've been getting to know them, more and more since I've been doing the podcast and everything. But just to have, and it's just such a perfect title for an anthology, A Very Large Array, especially for fantasy and science fiction, because it's this array of stories by different authors on, there's vampire stories and post-apocalyptic stories, and all sorts of different material in the book.
Yeah, it's quite a mix, definitely. So, but sadly, when I think about the book, I realize how many of these wonderful writers we have sadly lost, over the years, and it's nice to know that they're still, their words are still there, their visions are still there, for people to read and enjoy.
Mm-hmm. And so just in case anyone's listening isn't clear, so when you say Roger, that's Roger Zelazny, and
Roger Zelazny,
that's George R. R. Martin and
Fred Saberhagen, Jack Williamson, Victor Milan, and we've lost many of them, many of the greats. So.
Yeah. I was noticing that there's 12 authors in the book, and half of them are no longer with us, sadly. Including several just in fairly recently. Just a couple since 2018. But it is such a nice tribute that this book is out there for people to read, and it's a fantastic selection of stories. I mean, it's just a really high level of writing in the book. So I definitely recommend people pick up a copy. Just for example, the first story in the book is For a Breath I Tarry by Roger Zelazny. And we just did my friend Tom Garenzer and I just recently on the show, we did a whole 2.5-hour review of the new Best of Roger Zelazny book that just came out from the SF Masterworks series. And that was my favorite Zelazny story, is A Breath I Tarry. So if anyone hasn't read that, you can read the best Zelazny story, in my opinion, in this book, along with 11 other great stories.
Yeah, we had fun. I mean, obviously I didn't edit much because these stories were already published, and honestly, I'm not sure I would have had the nerve to edit Roger Zelazny. Truthfully, I mean, he truly was a master of science fiction. And then there's Jack. I mean, Jack Williamson, who is in many ways the father of science fiction. I mean, he's credited in the OED with adding all of these words to the English language. And I know I'll forget some of them, but he invented the term terraforming and psionics and genetic engineering and humanoid in works that he was writing in the 1930s and 40s. So there was this just gift, this handoff from the past to the new young writers, that came in to help us create this anthology.
Yeah, it was really striking to me. And also each author in the book, they wrote a little author's foreword to their story, describing how they came to live in New Mexico and what it's meant to them and how it's influenced their writing and things like that. And so the Jack Williamson note says that he arrived in New Mexico in 1915 in a covered wagon, where it took him 17 days to get to New Mexico from Texas. So
yeah, yes, we definitely went from covered wagons to spaceships. I mean, Jack almost made it to 100. We lost Jack when he was 99. And he published his final novel, came out when he was 96. And, he's like, I want to be Jack. I want to be able to be publishing books well into my 80s and 90s like he did. So.
Yeah, the Jack Williamson story that always sticks in my mind is, I think it was Scott Edelman who told me this, but he said that he was at a convention one time and there was a panel on like what do young readers want these days or something like that. And so the panel's talking and Scott is looking around to the audience, and it's all these, new, it's kind of up and coming writers wanting to know how they can break in and sell their books and stuff. And then there's also Jack Williamson sitting in the audience, and he's probably, 80 years old or something at the time. And, that he always wanted to know.
Carefully keeping notes. Yeah, it was like, I think the panel is actually, what are editors looking for today?
Okay.
And there was Jack, he had his notepad and he had his pen and he was taking notes, because he always wanted to stay current.
Mm.
I love to burble about Jack because I don't want him to fall into the mists and be forgotten, because he is sort of a father figure. But we were sitting at dinner one night together at a convention. We'd all gone out to dinner, and Jack said, well, I sold a new short story. And everybody was like, hey, Jack, that's fabulous. He said, yeah, I got 10 cents a word, which is exactly what I got for my first short story in 1927.
Yeah, ouch.
The life of a writer is not all glamour.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the work of his that sticks out in my mind the most that I've read is he wrote a short story called With Folded Hands that he later expanded into his novel, The Humanoids. Yes. And the premise is that the robots, like all of the 3 laws of robotics, have been programmed to always be helpful and not allow human beings to come to harm. And so they interpret this as like, no, you humans can't do any work. That's too dangerous. Just let us do all the work and we'll handle it for you. Don't risk yourselves doing this, construction and things like that. And then the humans, don't like having, the robots doing all the work and having no purpose. And so it's this very sort of like soft sort of tyranny. And, the more AI develops and, seems poised to replace more and more jobs, that story just comes to seem more and more prescient and more relevant that he was writing about those issues, decades and decades ago.
Yeah, I think With Folded Hands was written in like 1947 or something. And he foresaw, what might come to pass. And, and small aside, I mean, it really irritates me so much that the movie that they made called I, Robot, that was supposed to be based on Isaac Asimov's I, Robot, if you watch that film, it mines far more from Jack's work than it does from and from I, Robot and from Asimov's work, and yet Jack was never credited. And I was furious on his behalf. I had at that point started working in Hollywood, and I was like, Jack, you should get a lawyer. And he was like, no, it's okay, it's fine. but I was furious for him because, go back and look at that, read With Folded Hands, and then go watch I, Robot again, and you're going to see some striking similarities.
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons to be furious about the iRobot movie that we don't have time to go into all of them right now.
We're not doing a film critique today, so I get it.
But in his author's note also, Jack says that he says something like, I wish I lived a little closer to the other authors in the book. Did you see him a lot around New Mexico, or was it more like at conventions that you would run into him?
Well, there is an event every April in Portales where Jack grew up and lived his life for the most of his life. called the Williamson Lectureship, and they bring in authors and editors and people to speak. It's a 3-day event. Connie Willis always comes down for the event. She's always the toast mistress of the thing. And so most of us would always go down to Portales for the chance to see Jack. And then at conventions were the most part. I mean, people forget how big New Mexico is. I mean, it's, like the 4th largest state in the country. And so, it's a 4.5-hour drive, and we were all somewhat separated. Most of us were in Albuquerque and Santa Fe area, but, there was Jack way off down in the eastern part of New Mexico, down near the Texas border. But he loved Portales, and once he finished living in LA, he returned to Portales to teach, and he taught for his entire career. He taught creative writing and English at Eastern New Mexico University, and passed on all of his knowledge. So
yeah, and it's the story in the book. It's called Jamboree. It's set in this future where robots run everything, and the only humans around are children who are sort of sacrificed when they start hitting puberty, because the robots want to stay in control. And it's a really creepy story. And
yeah.
I remember it, when I read it, I think in high school. It's always stuck in my mind. It's a really good story.
One of our friends, when they had their first child, their first baby, and they had him in that little baby thing where they would hop up and down, little kids.
Yeah. I know it well. Yeah.
Yeah. And in that story, Jack has, the hop for pop, So every time Jim would talk to his son when he was an infant, he'd go hop for pop, because he knew Jack's story.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I guess I'll just explain if people listening don't know the geography of New Mexico. So there are the 2 cities of Santa Fe and Albuquerque that are about an hour apart. So I get the impression a lot of science fiction authors who lived in one or the other were very often making the drive back and forth to see people, that it was sort of one extended community, those two cities.
Yeah, I mean, we had a writers' luncheon that called First Fridays, that Tony Hillerman, a famous mystery writer who wrote all the Jolie Porn Jim Chi books that are now being adapted for television on AMC, he put together this writers' luncheon. And so the first Friday of every month, all the writers would gather and just, hang out together, and they'd give each other encouragement and what was going on in their lives and possible markets opening up. So we had that. And then, of course, Walter John Williams and George Martin and myself, and later Roger Zelazny, we were all in a role-playing gaming group together. So, sometimes we would play in Albuquerque and other times we'd be playing in Santa Fe, depending on who was running the game. So there was a lot of cross-pollination, I guess you would say.
Yeah, and I've lived in a number of cities that had pretty strong science fiction scenes, like New York and Austin and Los Angeles. But this Albuquerque, Santa Fe scene does seem special to me. I mean, I never lived there, but it just seems like, in terms of how much the authors spent face-to-face time and how much they collaborated with people that they knew, that lived in the same area as them, and how fruitful those collaborations turned out to be in terms of, publications and readerships and everything. It does seem there's something special about the New Mexico scene. Is that how it seems to you?
Very much. I mean, I think partly, it's a relatively inexpensive place to live, and there's breathtaking beauty here, but it's also somewhat alien looking. And then there's all this, scientific power here with Los Alamos and Sandia Labs and the Santa Fe Institute. And then set in opposition to that is the fact that you could get your aura balanced at Santa Fe, or get a tarot card reading, or, get some crystals for your sinus infection. So there's this sort of weird juxtaposition of cutting edge science on the one hand, and then sort of weird woo-woo stuff that that goes on here. So whatever your taste is, you'll probably find some inspiration. And of course, we have the three cultures. And I think in some ways, I mean, I think in my introduction to my story, I wrote about that in some ways, New Mexico could be a template for what is inevitably going to happen with the United States, where we become a minority-majority country. Because New Mexico has always been that. And I think the fact that we have three cultures that bump along together in relative, good humor and peace, I think was also a factor that of those of us who are writing about alien cultures and first contacts and so on, that we sort of had a sort of strange example of that, right? That we were living among here.
Yeah, I wanted to read from the author's notes on why people say they like New Mexico. And so Walter John Williams, he says, the pace of life isn't as relentless as elsewhere, and one has the leisure and opportunity to contemplate things that, in a more swiftly paced brand of life, might be passed by or tossed out with the trash. There's also a funny line I wanted to mention from Fred Saberhagen. He says, they set off a nuclear bomb here once, as I enjoy reminding visitors from the East, and almost nobody noticed. So,
yeah.
So there is something about, just sort of like the vast empty stretches, and the quiet and the scale of things. Yeah, that does seem sort of conducive to a more contemplative pace of life.
Yes, I would agree with that. And they opened the Trinity site where the first atomic bomb was tested, I believe twice a year. Where people can go in, and they're always telling people, please don't pick up any of the fused radioactive pebble sand that you find. Please don't take it away with you. And of course, inevitably people do. But it's an odd place to think. And I mean, when I was studying up on Oppenheimer, I mean, the fact that this amazing landscape and the cultures also affected him deeply. I mean, it's why he put the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos. He had gone to a boys' camp there when he was a kid, a young teenager, and his heart was always in New Mexico.
You say in the book, you describe it as, quote, a harsh and beautiful landscape that can wrench the heart and sometimes kill the careless or the unwary. So I was going to ask you, next time I visit New Mexico, because I am a fairly careless and unwary person, what should I do to avoid being killed?
Well, people will, I always keep water in the car. I keep matches in the car. In the wintertime, or a lighter. In the wintertime, I always have a blanket. Just in case if you're making the drive between here and Portales, there's a lot of empty. And cars don't go by very often. And sometimes there isn't cell service. So you sort of always want to be ready in case you break down and you can keep yourself alive. So that's always what I do recommend. I mean, I had a friend who came and he was talking about, it was so beautiful. I parked my car and I just walked out into the desert, and he was wearing flip-flops and shorts. Nice. I was like, we have rattlesnakes. And, you really don't want to do that. I mean, you need to be prepared to go places here if you're going to go out into the wilderness. So that's my advice to you. But if you're in Santa Fe, you're fine, because we are very, very cosmopolitan here.
Yeah, I guess I'll just describe for people. So my wife and I, we made the drive from Austin to Santa Fe a few times now, actually. But so Austin is in the hill country, so it's quite beautiful with rivers and trees and hills and everything. And so you start driving west, and then once you get out of the hill country in West Texas, it's just like grass. Depending on how far north you are, it's either just flat grass as far as the eye can see, or flat dirt as far as the eye can see. And so you just cross this huge desert, and then you get to Santa Fe, and you go up into the mountains, and the air cools off, and it's just beautiful flowers and trees and blue skies and mountains and snow-capped peaks, and it's just the most beautiful place you've ever seen. And it's just such a just a striking drive to come out of the desert up into the mountains and see this really magical place.
It really is. And if you were coming from Austin and coming up on I-10 and then coming north, you were going up what's called the Route of the Dead Men, which was how the Mexican conquistadors traveled from Mexico City up into Santa Fe, up into New Mexico. And there is no water across that plateau. That's actually down near where the Trinity site is as well, where they detonated the bomb. And again, it's an odd mix because there was no consideration about the communities that lived downwind of that because they didn't know. I mean, they weren't fully aware of what it was they were unleashing. And there's a class action lawsuit that's still going on from these families, ranchers and, Hispanic folks who live down there whose grandparents, were lost to cancer because of the wind carrying the radiation across their property. Hopefully they will see justice too and be reimbursed for what happened. But I can't say enough. I mean, I love New Mexico. I was in LA for on and off with my work, but I always come home. There's something magical about this place.
Yeah, I feel like Google Maps should maybe have a little warning or something when you're driving along a road called the Route of the Dead Men or whatever it is. Just giving you a little heads up about that.
A little heads up, yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned in the introduction to this book too that this group of New Mexico writers has started being called the New Mexico Mafia. Do you remember when you first heard that term, or how that came about?
I'm trying to remember who called us that, and I think it was somebody back east. It sort of stuck. We were a little embarrassed about it, but. And I think some of it was also when George and I created Wild Cards, and then we invited everybody, all of our friends, to come write for Wild Cards so we could have fun together. And so it felt like we were this team, that was down here. I'm not sure. I know we didn't create that phrase. It was planted on us. And I'm not sure the mafia still exists. I mean, people's lives have diverged, their careers have diverged. I mean, George, Hollywood, me, Hollywood, there's been just things have changed, and we've lost people, but we have this whole new fabulous generation, coming up here too, of young writers that are coming up to give their vision and be inspired by New Mexico.
Yeah, I mean, I was telling you, man, I really enjoyed visiting Santa Fe and, and meeting a lot of people there. And there's I'd love to go back. There's a great community there. There's Beastly Books, and there's, the John Cocteau Theater. There's all this sort of, all these things happening. So for sure right now. But then I was looking at what was going on with the New Mexico Mafia when this book came out in 1987. And there was a lot of stuff going on. So Roger Zelazny was in the middle of his second Amber series. Walter John Williams had just published Hardwired the year before, which is one of his best known books, sort of a cyberpunk book. Stephen R. Donaldson had recently wrapped up the second Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, this huge best-selling fantasy series he had. Fred Saberhagen had just published Berserker Base, that's the one Berserker book that I read as a kid. So, and it's really good. I don't know if that was one of the best selling or best known ones or not, but it certainly sticks in my mind, since I encountered it as a kid. So yeah, I mean, when you think back on 1987, does that just seem like this huge ferment of stuff going on in that area?
Yeah, I mean, George and I had created Wild Cards the year before. I was fairly new in my career, so I was the newbie among these much more established writers. But there was a huge amount of energy happening, and we get older, and honestly, publishing has changed since those middle years of the 1980s. I mean, that was that was the high watermark. Mid-list writers were, breaking out of the mid-list, getting, $50,000, $100,000 advances. It was really kind of a golden age for science fiction. That now the whole business is changing and shifting, and we're all trying to readjust to, how do we continue to have a viable career in this new reality. And AI is part of it. I mean, what do editors do if somebody's sending in, having AI write a book in a week for them and sending it in? And how do they judge? How do they say no, we're not doing that? And how does the business work? I mean, more and more people are becoming hybrid or self-published authors, things that nobody even considered back, I would say, in that 87, 88 time. It was still very much traditional publishing and a different world.
Well, it's always stuck in my mind that you said that Fred Saberhagen put 5 kids through college on his income as a mid-list science fiction author, which is definitely a different time than now.
Well, and the former lawyer here can go on a little bit of a rant on why that happened. I mean, Fred was able to support a family, put kids through college because of his backlist. All the books that he'd written, all of the Berserker books, all of the other science fiction novels, he had written, were kept available. And then I may have the date wrong, but I think it was 1977, or maybe it was later, an infamous case went to the Supreme Court called the Thor Power Tools case. And Thor Power Tools, they made, power tools. And what had happened is the IRS had gone and said, okay, all of your inventory has to be counted as income. And as a result, if you had a warehouse full of widgets that you hadn't sold yet, you were suddenly taxed as if they were income. And so your taxes went up significantly. And the Supreme Court upheld the IRS and said, yes, that's income. Well, all of the publishers used to have giant warehouses, primarily in New Jersey, where they would keep piles of books where all of your backlist was. So if a bookstore in Austin or a bookstore in Minneapolis called up and said, hey, we're low on Fred Saberhagen books, can you send me? They would just go and ship books from the warehouse to that bookstore of Fred's Berserker books or, George's Dying of the Light. Well, once this decision came down, the publishers liquidated all of those books that they were holding in warehouses, let the warehouses go. And so now there's no backlist. Authors don't have a backlist anymore. I mean, if you're very, very famous, if you're George or Stephen King or J.K. Rowling, yeah, they're going to keep your books in print. But for most of us, our books go out of print relatively quickly. And at that point, you don't have this income coming in every 6 months from your royalties that you can depend upon. And Jack even said that's why he started writing the Book of Swords, the series, because he could.
You mean Fred? Fred said that?
Fred, not Fred. Yeah, Fred started doing Book of Swords because he needed to keep feeding that machine rapidly because there was no longer a backlist that was providing an income every 4 to 6 months coming in. And so that really did change the business, and it certainly changed the business for writers. You had to rethink how you were going to finance this career, and it became more difficult.
The Berserker book I mentioned, Berserker Base, is actually interesting because it sort of includes stories by different authors, including Stephen R. Donaldson and Roger Zelazny. And then I know also Fred and Roger collaborated on a novel called Coils in 1982. I was just curious if you were you around for those collaborations, or do you have any? Did they ever talk about those?
I wasn't. I know that Fred and Roger were very close. Their families were constantly doing holidays together. They had a deep friendship. I was too new to be included in any of those, but I knew they were happening. And I love the Berserker books. I think they were just great. I always felt like Star Trek's the giant killer cornucopia thing felt like a Berserker story, like they had read one of Fred's Berserker books when they did that. But I'm not sure about the time overlap for those two things. But yeah, these were terrific books.
Yeah, no, I think the Berserker books, I mean, I don't know if they influenced that specifically, but I'm sure they influenced a lot of film and television that came afterwards. I mean, you sort of see the footprints all over the place. Well, so you mentioned that you were kind of, so Jack and Roger and Fred were kind of like the older generation, right? When you got into science fiction, right? So what was kind of like, how did you kind of, what was your, who were the first kind of people you met, and kind of what was your entree into that world?
It was Victor Milan and Walter John Williams. I was just about to start law school, and I've always been a huge science fiction fan. I read the books from the time I could read on my own. I just loved science fiction. And I was working in a little bookstore, and Vic walked in. He was 19 years old. He had just taken time off from college and gone hitchhiking around Europe. And he walked in and we started talking, and we just instantly became friends, best friends. And he was writing. He and, oh God, forgive me, I've just blanked on his name. I'm so embarrassed. It'll come to me. And we became friends.
Bob Vardaman?
Bob Vardaman, thank you. Yeah, he and Bob Vardaman were working on a funny fantasy series together. And, Vic was doing his thing, and we became friends. And I never really thought about becoming a writer. I mean, I was going to law school. And then I realized how much I hated lawyers. I love the study of law, and the law is integral in a lot of my work. I mean, it's always there. But I was really unhappy. And Vic said to me, I bet you could write if you tried. And so I started writing in secret, and Vic and I would meet up usually at midnight. I don't know why we always met at midnight, but we did, at the Vips Big Boy on 4th Street. And I would bring him a chapter I had written, all typed out, and he would read it and give me notes and, correct things and say, well, I think you ought to do this. And I go rewrite, and kept encouraging me. And then through Vic, I met Bob. Well, actually, I have to back up a little bit. Where it really started was Vic I went to an autograph party, and Vic was there, and Fred Saberhagen and Roger, and Susie McKee Charnas. And after the autographing, the Saberhagens were doing a barbecue, and they invited me to come along as Vic's, Girl Friday puppy, thing. Here, why don't you come? And I was working in this law firm, and I was deeply unhappy. And I go to this party, and these are the most fascinating people I had ever met in my life. I mean, they were just amazing. Bob and Vic were so quick and so funny, and they were making me, I was laughing, and Susie Charnas was talking about the effect of language on culture. And Fred was reading a letter from some lunatic in Romania who had read Fred's Holmes Dracula file and clearly thought he was Dracula. So he's reading this letter, and it got weirder and weirder. And we left the party, and I grabbed Vic and I said, I have to be part of this world. And that's when he said, I bet you could write if you tried. And then he became my mentor. And then Vic introduced me to role-playing games. And it was a game that Walter John was running. It was Call of Cthulhu. I'd never played role-playing games. And we went off to play a night of having arcane horrors drive us mad and then kill us. And that's when I met Walter, and then became just part of this circle. It was John Miller was in the gaming group. Walter was a game master. And then when George moved down to New Mexico, we were all like, hey, hi, because George arrived here and didn't know anybody except Roger, and then met all of us, and then we dragged him into role-playing games. And as he says, wasted I don't know how many years of his life while he ran Super World for us, that then spawned Wild Cards. And so it was just this, we just kind of kept accreting people, until we were all rolling along together. And then of course, George gave me the encouragement to write for Hollywood and helped me break into Hollywood. And that's the thing I love about writers, is that most of us, everybody pays it forward. It's the most generous group of people you'll ever meet. We always try to give a hand up to new writers. I mean, if you meet a writer who tries to shut you down, walk away, because that shouldn't be what happens. Usually we're there to say, hey, let me give you some help. Let me give you some advice. What do you want to know? Welcome to the world, to this wonderful world. And certainly in science, I mean, I'm not a mystery writer. I don't know how it is in other genres, but in science fiction, it tends to be very, very supportive, very encouraging, very welcoming to the new young writer coming up.
Yeah, I had a couple of Vic Milan questions I wanted to ask you. So just his bio, it says, I've done time as a cowboy, semi-pro actor, computer support tech, and Albuquerque's most popular all-night progressive rock DJ. And I was just curious, he sounds like a colorful character. Did you ever listen to his radio show, or kind of like, what do you know about some of those hobbies?
By the time I met Vic, he wasn't really doing that anymore, but he could. There was a reason he always ended up the MC for costume competitions at conventions, because he could do a pattern, he could do the whole. He had all that going, and there is one funny. I mean, Vic did know from horses. He had ridden when he was a younger guy, and. And at one point, I actually mentioned this at our memorial for Vic. So the Romance Writers of America had decided that they were going to do this train that was going to go from, I think, Chicago or New York to Los Angeles, and then the conference, and it was going to be all these romance writers. And Vic's then agent at the time called up and said, well, Vic, we know you know how to ride horses. And as the train goes through New Mexico, they want to have love bandits attack the train. And could you be one of the love bandits? And then they'll ride up and they'll get on the train and they'll steal kisses from the romance writers. And we were all, so Vic declined becoming a love bandit. But we laughed about that for the years after, and him going off to be a love bandit for the romance writers. But sadly, we never made that happen.
Yeah, I don't know anything about horses, but that sounds a little dangerous, riding a horse up to a train and getting on the train. Am I wrong about that?
Yeah, it was kind of a terrible idea, unless you have horses that were accustomed to, galloping alongside a train. You'd need a movie horse for that. So
were they unable to recruit any love bandits in the end? They had to.
No, they never did. They never did manage to put together the love bandits. So George still mourns about that. He's like, maybe because George owns a train now. So he's like, well, maybe we could. Would you like to be a love bandit? And I'm like, no, George, I'm not going to ride my horses next to your train.
That's funny. I mean, it says that you and Vic wrote a novel together, Runespear, in 1987.
Yes, we did. It actually came out of a night of gaming, role-playing. Vic ran a one-shot role-playing game where it's 1936 and we get recruited by Heinrich Himmler to go and find the spear of the rune spear, the Gungnir, whatever, Odin's spear. And we played the game, and we started at like 7 p.m. We had pizza and everything. And then we played, and the game, we played till like 3 or 4 in the morning in order to finish it. And I went home and got a little sleep and took care of my horses and got up the next morning and I called Vic and I said, we have to write this. At the same time, he was saying to me, we have to write this up. And so we turned it into a novel. And it was a ton of fun. We had a lot of fun writing that book. He would handle certain pieces. We sort of divided up the characters between us, and then wrote our sections. And it was a lot of fun, and we sold it too. I mean, it sold in Britain, and with it had the world's ugliest cover. Oh my God, the cover in the United States was terrible. But yeah, that was the first time I'd really ever done a collaboration, and I think it was good practice for when George and I did, created Wild Cards, because that's a very collaborative process because it's a shared world anthology.
Yeah, I mean, you've described Vic as like your writing mentor. Do you remember any specific like pieces of advice he gave you, or ways in which he influenced your writing?
I think the major thing, Vic was one of the best action writers I've ever read, and writing action is really hard. To make it visceral, make it come to life on the page. And I think probably that's the place he gave me the best guidance was how to write an effective action. I think that would probably be the and also Vic, like me, we tended to be architects. We like to outline. I like to have a very strong outline before I ever start a book or a script. And Vic was the same way. He was not a pantser. He wasn't going to wing it. He wanted to know. So I think, and then some of that was my own nature because I was a lawyer, and so there is this. I need a game plan. I need a step-by-step process here. So those are the two places I think probably he was most influential for me.
Mm-hmm. His bio, it also says, I've published almost 100 novels and numerous short stories, including the Prometheus Award-winning The Cybernetic Samurai from 1986. Did you ever talk to him about that book, or were you around when?
I read it. I read it in manuscript, and as he was writing it, and we would meet and have coffee and talk about it and what he was going to do next. It was probably Vic's best work. It really did capture. I mean, he really wanted to do something where you didn't have killer AI. He was like, why does it always have to be Skynet? Why can't it be like a child and it has honor? Vic was very interested in Japanese culture as well. So I think that helped influence. But I was very aware of the book, and I keep hearing about people's books before they get started. Like, hey, I've got this idea for this book. George told me about Game of Thrones because of the opening scene of Game of Thrones over lunch one day before he ever wrote it. So.
Oh wow.
Yeah, he said, yeah, I've got this idea. He had three ideas. He had a horror novel, he had a big science fiction novel, and he had this fantasy novel, and he wasn't sure which one he was going to write. Was waiting to get feedback from his editor, his agent. But he told me about, I have this vision of the stag and the wolves and and then the kids and the young pups. And so he told me about the opening before he ever wrote it. So I know some writers can't stand to talk about their work because they feel like it kills the passion. Because it's like if they talk about it to you, they've already done it. Other writers find the more they talk about it, the more excited they get. I fall into that camp. But we did seem to have this group and we also formed a writers group. We've had various incarnations of a writers group that, where, Daniel Abraham, Walter, me, George, lots of writers were in our writers group, and I find a good writers group is enormously helpful to you as you're working.
Yeah, I never tell anyone about anything I'm working on because I don't want them to be, I'll describe the idea and they'll be like, I don't like that. Or, it'll kind of like kill my enthusiasm for it. It's sort of like has to reach a certain critical mass of, where it can kind of like stand on its own before it gets exposed to the cruel, hard world.
The withering eye, yes, I get it. Yeah, no, I'm always getting very, I've got this cool idea, and I want to talk about it,
Yeah, well, that's cool. So, okay, so you mentioned you met George. So so he moved to Santa Fe in 1979, and I guess I never realized that when he moved to Santa Fe, just how new of a writer he was. I think he had published one novel and maybe like a dozen or so short stories. And that was...
But I thought he had won some Hugos by then for some of his short work.
I think he had won some awards for sure. But, he'd only published, one novel at that time. So like, what was kind of your impression of him when he showed up in Santa Fe? Were you kind of like, oh, this guy is destined to be a best-selling author? Or was he just kind of like part of the gang at that time?
He was just kind of part of the gang. The only person George knew down here was Roger. And then Roger introduced him to the rest of us because George was, he was brand new in town, didn't know anybody. And so we immediately said, hey, have you ever done role playing? And we dragged him in. Vic was running a game called Morrow Project, where we are woken up after the apocalypse and we have to rebuild civilization. And so, George, we got him into that. And like I said, it was a very welcoming group of people. Tony Hillerman was immediately told George about the First Friday luncheons and, so that he could meet people and, start to form a community.
Mm. And then
we also knew he was award winning. And so we knew that, this guy was clearly, destined to do some great work. But I don't think any of us ever conceived that, Game of Thrones, he would become Mr. Game of Thrones,
Yeah. I don't know if you've ever seen it. There's a website called Wildcards World, and there's an article on there kind of about the early days, like sort of the proto Wildcards group.
We manage that. It doesn't get as much traffic. I'll be really blunt. We don't allow for comments because we just don't want a bunch of angry trolls who are mad at George to come and comment. So it probably isn't as vibrant, but no, it is ours. It belongs to our Wildcards Consortium.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So I wanted to ask, so there's some quotes I came across. So one of it says, it must have suddenly seemed to this group of creatives that in this company, with this amount of useful gossip and healthy competition, it was possible to go from Albuquerque to anywhere they wanted. It might have felt like the early days of the Beatles. So is that your impression that it felt like the early days of the Beatles around 1987 or so?
Hard for me to say. I studied opera in Vienna, so I'm not exactly a rock and roll person. I presume that's something George wrote. I think it just felt like family. We literally did holiday dinners together because most of us didn't have a lot of family. And so we became family. I would do Thanksgiving, and John and Gail would often do Christmas dinners. And we had our gaming community. So we were gaming a lot, 2-3 nights a week. It's a wonder any of us ever wrote anything as much as we were rolling dice. So yeah, I'm not sure I would say that. I think it was more, to me, it felt more like family, but and I miss it. People marry, they have kids, they move away, things change, and those days are sort of have faded. But it was a really wonderful time.
So how about when George was working, because he was working on sort of his early novels, so Fever Dream, Armageddon Rag, and Tough Voyaging, kind of in this sort of the mid
Yes.
80s sort of period.
Yeah.
Did he talk about those as he was writing them, or did you, like, what was your...
Um, no, at the time, we hadn't really formed a writers group yet, per se. And George, I mean, he would mention them. We knew what he was working on. I mean, and, he would do things like, "Oh my God, I never realized how hard it is to get song approvals to use
Oh God, yeah.
songs." Yeah, I mean, all these kind of. So we would hear about the process. It wasn't that we were necessarily, reading his manuscripts. Vic and I were more inclined to trade manuscripts to each other. Then and then we did put together the writers group, and that was really valuable. To watch Walter working on Hardwired and read chapters and during our meetings. George did not workshop Game of Thrones with us. If he workshopped anything, it was usually a wild card story, back when he had time to write wild card stories.
Yeah. Well, so what was it like when Walter John Williams was writing Hardwired? Kind of what was that like watching that book come to be written?
It was great. We all knew he had something. He had done something really. I mean, to me, he had tapped into cyberpunk in a way that made it more real, I guess, and a little. Vic once described cyberpunk as MTV writing, and I could see the point. I think Walter deepened it when he wrote his cyberpunk piece, and of course he then turned it into a game, and I play tested the game because I read the novel as it was being written, and then when he started putting together Hardwired the game, which was published, I was one of the play testers in that. So we have this cross-pollination that went on with all of our various endeavors. I mean, I've never tried to be a game designer, but Walter is very good at it. That came out of our role-playing days.
Yeah. Well, so why don't you talk about what were the different role-playing games that you guys played? You mentioned Call of Cthulhu, and then sort of what were some of the other ones?
Then Vic gave George Superworld for a Christmas present one year, and that launched the Superworld craze, because he knew George had been a big comic book fan. And so he gave him the game, and he ran that for years. And then Walter was very creative. Walter we played Walter's Privateers and Gentlemen, where we are young naval officers in the British Navy. We played his Hardwired game. We play tested, and then we also just played it because it was fun. And then Walter's enormously creative and one of the best game masters I've ever played with as a player. He would create games. We played a Roman Republic game for 10 years. And he also created games where we would play police officers investigating crimes, and then another game where we were sort of Dortmunder criminals with all of the hijinks that happened to Dortmunder criminals based on the Dortmunder books. So he would tend to create his own games rather than use something that had already been published.
And if people don't know, he had started out, I believe, writing historical novels, kind of like Age of Sail type historical novels. So, he knows a lot about different historical periods, that one included.
No, when we went to the Worldcon in England, Walter and I hung out together and did some sightseeing together, and he would quiz me about, is that a sloop or is that a schooner? And I had better get it right from playing Privateers and Gentlemen, because he really did know a lot. He does know a lot about the heroic Age of Sail.
So when you're playing like in the Roman Republic or the Age of Sail, kind of what are the adventures like, and sort of what was sort of the overall, like when you played for 10 years, kind of like what was that overall story that unfolded?
Well, it's, young Roman nobles trying to rise to political power was sort of the setup. Walter is actually, he could have been a great mystery novelist. I don't know why he actually never really did that, because a lot of Walter's games tended to focus on mysteries, um, murders, who stole something, what's going on. And so, we would explore those and have to solve the crimes. It was really fun, but it was also a whole lot of us in this group were frustrated actors. Vic had acted, I had acted, Walter had been an actor, Daniel. And so our nights of gaming ended up sometimes feeling way more like improv theater than a game. I mean, we'd go sometimes a whole night and never roll dice to see if we succeeded or failed at something, because we were so busy role playing with each other. People marrying and, starting feuds with each other. Yeah, I still love it. In fact, I was playing in a game last night on Zoom with friends who are scattered all over the country. I thank God for this new technology. It saved us during the pandemic. And so we still play together, but we just do it on Zoom. I miss it. George has been talking about, I really miss gaming. And so hopefully he'll be able to simplify his life enough that we could start to do that again.
Yes. So in a typical, tabletop role-playing game, you'd have the party, and the party kind of goes around and has adventures together. Is that what these games were like, or was it like sort of cutting from storyline to storyline, or the characters separated?
We would, mostly we were, sort of linked together. We don't go to war together, or we would investigate a crime together or whatever. George ran a medieval campaign once as the game master. But it's I think George, given his nature, would love it if we would pit each other against each other more. But most of us didn't want to do that. We like to be comrades and go do things. And Call of Cthulhu, you're going to go crazy and die at some point. So that was, the option is, how long can I stay sane and alive? But the other games, there were actual, we had to, when we were playing the Rome game, we had to plan our campaigns and, politic and give our speeches, to win favor. George's says, citizenship for Cisalpine Gaul. That was his big campaign speech for his character. So,
well, when you say that George always wanted the players to be pitted against each other or whatever, it reminds me, when I interviewed Jane Lindskold, she told this story about a campaign where George was the Rock, and he was planning to betray all the other characters. And
yes, yeah, that's George. There was one historic night of Cthulhu where we were being set upon by monsters and cultists, and George's character bravely said, "I'll go back for the guns." He ran away and left us and never came back with the guns.
So did all the characters all die then, or?
No, we managed to barely survive with many wounds. Came back and found him and said, "What were you doing?" And George's characters, you come up with a character and you get more stats sometimes if you're like a coward or you're a drunkard or whatever. And then George always played characters who were looking out for themselves first and foremost. He's not going to nobly sacrifice himself. Let's put it that way.
So did these big campaigns, like the 10-year-long campaigns, did they come to a conclusion, or did you just kind of like get more interested in a different game and sort of move on?
The problem was that George and I ended up in Hollywood, and we ended up, the game just sort of petered out. I really missed that game. It was a great game, the Roman campaign, but just life intruded, and we weren't able to keep continuing to do that. We were younger and we had, I guess, more time or something, but we haven't been able to recreate it. I think if we could put the group back together again, it would be, And part of it is distance. I mean, Walter lived down south of Albuquerque, and George and I are in Santa Fe, and it's just people had children and got married and had kids and various things that interfered with our ability to keep getting together for way too many nights a week for way too many hours and play. So.
But so kind of like in the Roman game or the Age of Sail game, kind of where did the characters end up? Like after, did they did they rule the empire, or like where did they?
No, we never quite got there. We were still, I think I had just been elected consul or something. I think I didn't do that. And I had become a captain in the heroic Age of Sail. I mean, I know I talk a lot about the gaming, but it actually, a number of the characters in my books are characters that I played in games. I think they're wildly creative. If they don't just become about rolling dice and killing monsters, if you make it a whole world and you build a character who's really fully fleshed out. And Walter has done that too. We've taken things from the games and said, I'm going to use this. I'm going to build something around this particular character that I've invested so much effort in. So.
Yeah, well, it does really strike me how many great works of fiction have come out of this group that spent so much time tabletop role-playing. And I wonder if would you recommend writers tabletop role-play, or is that like, how would you compare spending time doing that to spending time doing writing workshops or reading or whatever? Like, what do you?
I think it's a nice thing to add into those other processes of doing workshops and reading. I think role playing. I mean, if you're not embarrassed to fling yourself into it and immerse yourself and really explore the character and explore the relationships between the various characters in the game. And we see that in Wild Cards, which of course is a shared world anthology. And it's a number of writers. We all get to use each other's characters, have our characters interact. And it's fascinating to see how another writer views your character, because you have a vision of them as this person and somebody else sees them completely different. I mean, I see Dr. Tachyon as a tragic but heroic figure. And Lou Shiner, Lou Shiner thought he was a wimp, And so it was, it gives you an interesting perspective on the person, the people you've created. I mean, I don't know for other writers, but for me, they become very, very real. The people I create and put in my books, they invade my dreams and they whisper to me sometimes about things they want to do. So.
Yeah, and I definitely want to hear more about Wild Cards. I was telling you before we got on the call here, I was like, that's such a big topic. I feel like we're not going to have time to do it in this conversation.
I think we should probably just do a Wild Cards conversation.
Yeah, so I definitely want to come back and do that sometime. I'll ask you just a couple more questions. I didn't even realize. I just checked that we're over an hour here. I've been having such a good time talking to you. I didn't even realize we were almost out of time here. But I guess I had a couple other questions just about a very large array. So you mentioned earlier Susie McKee Charnas. And her story in here, it's about a vampire who goes to the Santa Fe Opera. And I think you mentioned that you trained to be an opera singer. So did you really resonate with that story, or kind of what did you think of the...
I love that story. And of course, having been to the opera, I know exactly where that balcony is and where you threw the body over. It's again using your environment to deepen and make your prose that much more immersive. I love that story. I was so glad Susie let us reprint that particular story.
The Santa Fe Opera, it's outdoors, I guess. Is that pretty unusual, or?
It's an open air opera. It's completely covered now because they were trying to keep the middle seats from everybody getting rained on, but it is an open air opera. It's a fabulous opera. It's so worth, get yourself a nice dinner and tailgate in the parking lot, and then go into the opera and spend the evening there. I mean, when the first opera I ever saw as a kid, probably not the best opera for a child, was Oedipus Rex, and we often get these big thunderstorms in the summertime here in New Mexico. And as Oedipus is tearing out his eyes, there was this bolt of lightning that came down, and you could see it behind the stage, because the stage is open in the back. So this bolt of lightning came down as the crescendo of the orchestra, and Oedipus tears out his eyes. And, it was, and then when La Traviata, she's laying in bed in Act 4 and she's dying of consumption, and the curtains on the bed were gently blowing because there was a breeze coming through, and it was just so evocative. So, it's a wonderful place to go and hear great music.
Do you get to go these days very often, or are you kind of busy?
Yeah, I try to go. I try to go every year. I'm peeved at myself. I didn't go this year, and I wish I had, because they had a fantastic season with a lot of operas I love, but I just never got organized to go. And I'm going to definitely rectify that this coming summer, because I want to get back to the opera.
I was astounded reading the Susie McKee Charnas story, how much detail there was about the opera and how it operates behind the scenes and everything. I was like, wow, did she work at the opera or do a ton of research? Or she
did a ton of research, and you can take tours, and they do show you how everything works at the opera. They do a tour thing during the summer. So.
Yeah. There was another thing too. I recently read the collected letters of Roger Zelazny, and it's like this 1,000-page book of all his letters that he wrote to his best friend Carl Yoke. But that really struck me as just how many live performances he went to in Santa Fe. It seems like every week, if not more often, he was going to some theatrical thing. It was really sounded really, really cool.
This town is filled with art and great restaurants and music. We have a chamber music festival during the summer. We have the opera. We have the Southwest Opera company that operates during the winter down in Albuquerque. I sang with the Civic Light Opera for years that did Broadway. We have a very vibrant society here.
Susie McKee Charnas, she also says in her author's note, you can't go to the Shalako at Zuni, for example, without having your mind kicked into an unfamiliar place that you perhaps never suspected or never believed was there. What is the Shalako at Zuni?
It's Shalako.
Shalako.
Yeah, Shalakos are manifestations of spirits, gods, and it's a festival that the men put on these frames with the Shalako figure, and in that moment, they are no longer the men from the Pueblo. They are that particular spirit. And they run in across the fields at sunrise. And it's very bad luck if a Shalako falls. And these things are massive that they're encased in. So you always have to make sure that if the Shalako falls, run, because there are other Kachina figures with yucca whips, and they'll whip you if a Shalako falls. Doesn't happen very often. And then it's a feast, and all the houses are open, and everybody has food, and they share food, and that's again this thing of this mix of cultures here, where if you're a Taos Pueblo, they'll finish Mass, a Catholic Mass, but then they'll go out and have a ceremony from their own traditions, a corn dance or a butterfly dance or, whatever. And some feast days, the Pueblos are closed to outsiders. It's very private. It's very personal.
There's a story in this book called Sliding Rock by Terry Boren. That's set on a reservation. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you came to include that in the book?
Just again because it brought a different aspect, and Terry is a very fine short story writer. I'm sorry, I can't remember a lot of details right now. It was quite a long time ago.
Yeah, no, for sure.
So yeah, I'm afraid I can't be too helpful on that one.
Yeah, it's just it's set on a reservation, and there's the main character he's sort of like on the reservation teaching I forget, high school or college, and he meets this young woman who's sort of mysterious, and there's this sort of like skinwalker thing going on where someone's been digging up graves, and it's all very mysterious. So yeah, definitely people should go check out that story as well. I guess maybe do you want to say a little bit about, you wrote a story called Requiem that's in the book. Do you want to talk about that?
Oh, I'm like Roger. One time Roger was having to do I think I just wanted to write about, if this is the story I think it is.
There's the Somnas, and they're kind of like in artificial wombs, and they control the sort of people outside the wombs.
They control the people that live through them. And I think it's, again, just my fascination with music, to some degree, and the idea that people can. I'm so embarrassed. I can't even remember details of the story. I should have reviewed it before we talked, but I've been doing other things. I've been kind of busy with stuff. So I'm gonna punt and not say too much about it. I'm sorry.
You started to say Roger. I know there was this anecdote I heard about where he like lost a trivia contest because he couldn't remember a detail from his own.
A trivia contest about his own work. They would ask him a question, and he would just get this sort of bemused expression, and then shrug and go, "I don't remember. I wrote that years ago." It's that happens to us. I mean, we move on to the next thing, and then that fills all of our thoughts, and everything else sort of fades away. I mean, when I'm writing a series, I have to take all of these notes so I can remember what the heck I did in book one, as opposed to the other, the books that I did and I'm doing now. It just gets very hard to keep everything straight,
Yeah. Yeah, no, this book came out in 1987, so it's definitely
So I don't quite recall the story I wrote, honestly.
Yeah. Well, maybe do you want to, just to wrap things up, you can tell us about some of your work that's a little fresher in your mind, because you have just recently completed the some of the series that we've talked to you about before on the show, the Imperium and the Carolingian.
Yeah. My Imperial series is up and done, all 5 books. I like to finish things. I hate unfinished series. I love series to read. And it breaks my heart when I don't ever get to finish them, or the author doesn't get to finish them. So I figured out I wanted to finish mine. And then I was able to write the 4th and final book that wrapped up my Carolingian series, which is about the war between science and rationality and superstition and religion and magic. And, to write a fresh new book, and that's all available now. And I've just started a new fantasy series. I've always been terrified to write fantasy. But I have had this idea of a magic system based on music, and it's been haunting me. And so I finally sat down and started it. And then I also have a couple of TV projects, all of which would shoot in New Mexico. If I can ever get any of them sold, market's really tough right now. So I've been very busy with those screenplays and working on that, and also starting this new novel series. But right at the moment, it's plotted to be 2 books. We'll see if it expands beyond that. But right now it's 2, and I'm in book 1. So,
and it's more of a kind of like epic fantasy or secondary world fantasy than. It's not like an urban fantasy.
No, it's not urban fantasy. It's definitely a new world with, that's the other thing. I don't have Vic to draw my map anymore. Vic was a really good artist too, and I can't go to Vic to say, make a map of my world. So I'm trying to figure out like where are the kingdoms, and what's the governmental system, and what's going on, and fantasy everything I've written has either been futuristic but based on our world, or contemporary, like the Carolingian series. This idea of having to come up with a whole new world and religions and cultures, and and not fall into the, gee, this just feels like Dragon Age. It's got elves and dwarves and humans. Oh my. and to try to make it feel different is proving to be, it's a challenge, but it's fun. So that's what I'm doing right now.
Yeah, I've heard George say about writing like epic fantasy, just be like, oh God, what am I going to name these mountains now? It's just, there's so much stuff you have to.
I know. I'm like,
invent.
Okay, what is this village they're supposed to be going to perform in? What shall I call it? Greenvale? I don't know. It's a lot more work than something that's based off of our society and our culture. So.
Yeah, well, definitely looking forward to it. It might be a little while before you finish that, but definitely we'll keep an eye out. But you, I guess you probably don't have a title or anything at this point.
No, titles are the bane of my existence. I suck at them. And so there's like it's the last thing I ever come up with is the title. And I usually go around asking other people, what do you think I should call this book? Because I think they're really hard. But
Yeah, but until then, people can go check out those two long series that are completed, that are all out there.
They're available on all the different platforms and print on demand. And I don't have audiobooks of the Carolingian yet. I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to do that. If I'm going to read them, or if I'm going to hire somebody and get them recorded. So we'll see where that is, but. There is audio available on Imperials and then all the other formats. So,
yeah. All right, great. So, do you have any other final thoughts? Any other projects or anything?
No. I will probably have to slip away because I have another appointment at 3:30. But this was so much fun. I always love visiting with you, David. So.
Yeah. Thanks so much. So, again, we've been speaking with Melinda Snodgrass about her anthology, A Very Large Array: New Mexico, Science Fiction and Fantasy. So, Melinda, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. Appreciate it.
And that was our interview. So, big thanks again to Melinda Snodgrass for joining us on the show. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So, if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please support us on Patreon over at patreon.com/geeks or via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.